IBM DB2. Your data future is about more control, more flexibility. IBM DB2, the AI database. AI starts here.
Hi, I'm Robert Catterall, an IBM DB2 for ZOS specialist, and this is another in the series of videos based on entries in my DB2 for ZOS blog, which is called Robert's DB2 Blog. In this one, I'm going to talk about what I feel is the single most important metric when it comes to DB2 for ZOS buffer pool monitoring and tuning. And that metric is, well, first let me tell you what it's not. It's not the buffer pool hit ratio. For a long, long time, DB2 people would focus on the buffer pool hit ratio, thinking that that is the most important metric. That's the one you need to keep an eye on with respect to buffer pool monitoring and tuning. And DB2 monitors will often calculate that for you. I myself, some years ago, would say the same thing. Yep, buffer pool hit ratio. No longer. I really find the buffer pool hit ratio to be of little value. If I'm looking at a DB2 monitor report, providing information about buffer pools, and it's got the hit ratio for a buffer pool, it's calculated, it's right there in front of me, I just ignore it. Because I think a much, much more important and effective metric for buffer pool monitoring tuning is the total read IO rate for the buffer pool. Don't worry about the hit ratio. It's the total read IO rate. And that's real simple. It's all the read IOs for a given buffer pool per second. So that's all the synchronous reads plus all the prefetch reads per second. And yes, the prefetch reads. Prefetch reads matter, right? They may not be quite as important as synchronous reads, but they matter. So why is buffer pool's total read IO rate? Again, that's all reads, synchronous and asynchronous per second. Why is that the most important metric for buffer pool monitoring and tuning? Why that over the hit ratio? Several reasons. First of all, the hit ratio can present you with what you might consider a false positive. Like, oh, look at this buffer pool's hit ratio. It's in the high 90s%. My work here is done. I'll move on to some other buffer pool. I would say your work may well not be done. So you can see a high hit ratio and think, oh, well, that one's good, move on. No, you could do better. Also, it can be a little strange. Different monitors have different formulas for calculating it. I've seen negative buffer pool hit ratios, which are all weird. The total read IO rate, right? Why focus on that? Why is that more important? Because, right? Because think about this. Every single read IO, every single one for a buffer pool, synchronous or asynchronous, every single one consumes some CPU time. Depending on the nature of the IO and the nature of the process driving it, the CPU time consumed for that IO might be general purpose CPU, it might be zip engine CPU, but it's CPU, right? And any CPU save is good. And so every single read IO you can eliminate saves CPU. An individual read IO does not consume a whole lot of CPU, but if a buffer pool is driving thousands of read IOs per second, then if you can drive that down considerably, you'll save quite a bit of CPU. So the buffer pool total read IO rate, it's real easy to get that. You could get the numbers from a DB2 monitor. That could either be from a statistics long report generated by your monitor. Depending on the monitor you use, that might be called a statistics detail report. It could be an online display of buffer pool activity provided by your monitor. You could also get the numbers from the output of the DB2 command display buffer pool. And the one I like to use is display buffer pool parentheses active close parentheses detail. Display buffer pool parentheses active close parentheses detail. And that will show you information for all the active buffer pools for a given DB2 subsystem. If you use a monitor, right, it's going to already give you rates per second. Again, depending on the monitor, the rate might be reported per minute. Okay, divide that number by 60 to get per second. So you'll see in a report or display provided by your monitor for a given buffer pool, the number of synchronous reads per second and the number of list prefetch, sequential prefetch, and dynamic prefetch reads per second, right? So 4 numbers. Sequential reads per second, asynchronous reads per second, that is, and then the 3 kinds of prefetch. Sequential prefetch reads per second, list prefetch reads per second, dynamic prefetch reads per second. And make sure with prefetch, what you're using are prefetch reads per second, not prefetch requests, because a prefetch request doesn't always lead to a prefetch read, right? Okay. If you're using the output of the command display buffer pool active detail, what I recommend that you do is issue that command, okay? Ideally, at the beginning of what would be a pretty busy hour for this DB2 subsystem. Issue the command, all right? Wait an hour, issue the command again, right? And it's what's in the second issuance of the command that you're going to want to look at, because that's going to capture statistics for the pool activity, right? For the pool since you issued the command an hour ago. So that will be 1 hour's worth of data in the output of the second issuance of the command. So divide the counters, right, for things like synchronous reads and prefetch reads by 3,600, right, and you get per second figures. By the way, you can verify that you've got statistics for the past hour when you look at the output of the second issuance of that command, because there'll be a timestamp there. Well, what if you look at that and you see, wait a second, that's not an hour ago, that's 37 minutes ago. That means that 37 minutes ago, somebody else went in and issued the command, right? And so check that to make sure you're looking at an hour's worth of data. Also, what if you issue the command and then wait an hour and 5 seconds or something? Do you need to divide by 3,605 seconds? You know, you could, but no big deal. If you're close to an hour, just divide by 3,600. It's close enough. And one other thing I'll say, if you're using the command output versus DB2 monitor report or display, the synchronous read numbers are actually in 2 fields. They're random synchronous reads and sequential synchronous reads. So add those 2 together, right, to get total synchronous reads. With the DB2 monitor, you just get a synchronous read number that adds both those up. Okay, so your total read IO rate, again, is all the synchronous reads plus all the sequential, list, and dynamic prefetch reads per second, right? That's the total read IO. Real easy to calculate that. You want to get that for each one of your pools. So here's the big question. If this is the most important metric, and I'm about to get to another reason why it's so important, how low should it be, right? What's good? What's bad? The shortest, right, and really best answer to that question is it should be as low as it reasonably can be, okay? What do I mean by reasonably? Well, right, you might think, oh, if I make this buffer pool bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, that total read IO rate for the pool will go down, 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 down. So I just ought to just keep going and going and going, right? Well, what you don't want to do is overtax the ZOS LPAR's real storage resource, right? That would be not good. So when I say drive it as low as you reasonably can, you can make buffer pools larger, right? Um, but when do you want to stop, right? So what you don't want is for the ZOS LPAR's demand paging rate to get out of hand. You can get that number from a ZOS monitor, okay? The demand paging rate, right? If you happen to be using IBM's RMF monitor, you can generate what's called an RMF summary report, and that'll show the demand paging rate. Anyway, the demand paging rate is the rate per second at which pages that ZOS sent out of real storage to auxiliary storage are brought back in on demand, right? And so you don't want, when you do anything that's going to cause greater real storage usage, such as make buffer pools bigger, you don't want the demand paging rate to get out of hand. You don't want to put too much of a strain on memory. Okay, well, what does that mean? I would say that a ZOSL PAR's real storage resource is not under too much pressure if the demand paging rate is either 0, right, or less than 1 per second. So I don't get, some people are really fixated on a 0 demand paging rate and get really agitated at the thought of that becoming non-zero. A demand paging rate of like 0.1 a second, you know, 0.5 a second, big deal, big deal. It's not something to get worried about. So if the demand paging rate is 0 or less than 1 per second, there's virtually no pressure on the ZOS LPAR's real storage resource. And you can make, for example, buffer pools maybe bigger than they are. When would I want to stop doing that kind of thing? Well, a demand paging rate of 0 or less than 1 per second, I think is ideal. I wouldn't want it to get higher than maybe 2 or 3 per second. If my demand paging rate is in the vicinity of 2 to 3 per second, I really don't want to use any more real storage, right? Unless I add to the LPAR's real storage resource, okay? So as you make buffer pools bigger to drive the read IO rate down for buffer pools, right? Keep an eye on the demand paging rate. Don't overdo it, right? Keep the demand paging rate low. And I'll have other of these video blog entries related to entries in the blog, other aspects of buffer pool tuning. But I just want to talk about that read IO rate, and just to give you some data points there. Highest I've ever seen for an individual buffer pool is, I think, a little over 13,000 a second. There are buffer pools that have a read IO rate of essentially 0. Everything assigned to that buffer pool, all pages of all objects fit in it. The read IO rate 0. And so, yeah, when you're looking at that and you see what it is for your buffer pools, it can be a good idea to see, well, where's it highest, right? If you've got 1 or 2 or more buffer pools that have a higher read IO rate than others, well, I would encourage you to make those buffer pools bigger to drive the rate down. So I'd concentrate on the ones that have the highest read IO rate, right? And I'll conclude this video entry by saying you might have heard, it may be a presentation I gave or something, this idea of well, you ought to strive for less than 1,000 read IOs per second for a buffer pool. Your total read IO rate for a buffer pool should be less than 1,000 per second. Some people misinterpreted that, thinking, oh, if it's bigger than that, oh, that's a problem. No, the reason I put that out there is some people would ask, okay, so the read IO rate should be lower. I've not really taken that approach in tuning buffer pools. Where do I start? And so that was a suggestion. I would say, well, do you have any buffer pools with a read IO rate of more than 1,000 per second? If so, start there. Make them bigger. See if you can get them below 1,000 per second while keeping the LPAR's demand paging rate low, ideally 0 or less than 1 per second. Okay. What if you don't have any buffer pools with a read IO rate of over 1,000 a second? Okay. See if you can get some of them below 100 per second. Some organizations that are really supersized buffer pools have almost all their buffer pools with read IO rates of less than 10 a second because they have ginormous buffer pools. I'll talk about that in some other entry. So again, the most important metric for DB2 buffer pool Performance monitoring and tuning is the total read I/O rate per second, and your objective, drive that down as low as you reasonably can, which means drive it down by making buffer pools bigger while keeping the system's demand paging rate low. So hope this has been helpful for you. Hope you see some others of these video blog entries also. Bye.